Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 7th of July 2023. Before we go and look at the front line in more granular detail, let's have a general overview of what's been going on over time. Warmap has done what they do every once in a while, which is produce graphs to represent the amount of land that either Russia or Ukraine have taken, liberated, got control of. So as we can see from the beginning of the war, the Russians in February 2022 and March 2022 added large swathes of Ukrainian land, 10.75%, 7.88% of the Ukrainian territory as a whole. And then as they pulled back from Kyiv and lost or basically conceded a bunch of the territory they had nominally gained, the Russians were seen to lose territory there. So the Ukrainians regained 5.54% of Ukrainian territory. And then as we see, the Russians then made marginal gains, and then Ukraine during the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the Kherson counteroffensive regained huge amounts of land. But that only denotes 1.67% of the whole Ukrainian territories. And then you see the gains from the Russians here, 0.05%, and recent gains by the Ukrainians, 0.02%, 0.04%. Now that's a good 120 square kilometers plus. It still denotes very small amounts of territory gain, because you may look at somewhere like this and go, well, that's nice around Robotina. That's a tiny area in the Donetsk or in the Zaporizhia Oblast there, and you may look at parts of Bakhmut and say, okay, they're doing really well, but that's in the whole of the Eastern Front. And actually, let's look at that as a percentage of the whole of Ukraine. So when you look at Ukraine taking 0.04% of their territory back, you might be unimpressed because that is a percentage of the whole of Ukraine, but actually it does mean something, right? There are areas of land being retaken by the Ukrainians. If we look here, this is kind of annexed territory that they controlled before the war. So 7% of Ukrainian territory as a whole, then added that 10.75, 7.88, then they lost a bit, and then all of this happened. This is just looking at it in rather than a kind of linear each side, we have the gains in total, and then now Russia control 17.5% as opposed to 7%. So they've gained a net gain of sort of 10% of Ukrainian land since the beginning of the conflict. It looks like that in terms of gains, and then pretty much stayed the same, then lost a bit and pretty much stayed the same. Now, this is a period of the Russian counteroffensive. This is how ineffective the Russian counteroffensive was. The Ukrainian counteroffensive still, in its early days, it has taken almost as much as Russia gained in their sort of the heady days of their Bakhmut offensive. But you can see this is a kind of comparison to more recent times. It sort of only goes back to May 2022 because there were huge Russian gains there. It's just to give you an idea of this, a sense of the comparative territory regained by the Ukrainians. So I think that gives you something of an overall understanding. Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny has come out and said that he said to Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, American military, that the counteroffensive is going according to plan. Now, that would be a kind of general appraisal. They would have adapted their plans after the kind of first week where they lost a few significant pieces of equipment, and then since then they're like, okay, we're not going to use equipment as heavily on the front lines, and we'll do a lot more damage with ranged munitions such as tube artillery, gimlers, and of course Storm Shadow. We also discussed with General Milley the urgent need for Ukrainians to have ammunition and weapons to continue their counteroffensive. So I think things are going fine. Yes, it's not like lightning counteroffensive. It's the same stuff I said before, but I just think that things are going all right. They are attriting the Russians really successfully, particularly in the south. There are some interesting moves around the Kupiansk-Kreminna front line, and we'll look at that now. Just to remind you that I have 2 or 3 lines in certain places on my maps. These are Russian defensive lines. The blue line is the Russian defensive line of Andrew Perpetua, the pro-Ukrainian mapper, and the red line is the pro-Russian mapper Syriac maps. These are where the Russians are at. So as we come down to look at what's going on in this area of Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna, Kupiansk up there, Svatova here, and Kreminna down by the forest there, the Ukrainians have actually been under a bit of pressure. Here's Andrew Perpetua's map. So we look a bit closer at this. You can see that there are red arrows in a number of places along the front, yes, in the forest, but up this axis from Kupiansk all the way down to Kreminna, you've got the Ukrainians pushing a little bit at the salient by Torsky and Terny, Adiivka here. But otherwise, actually, the Russians appear to be pushing quite a lot along that axis. So that's an interesting change. The ISW Institute for the Study of War American Military think tank says Russian troops attempted to advance near Novoselivska, Novoyehorivka, and Karmazinivka and Bilhorivka. So these places are along this front line. Novoselivska, it seems that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back a little bit from Kuzymivka going to the west there. And a number of places up and down here. I think going south from there, there was talk yesterday about activity in Krivoshivka. But yeah, as we come down, we'll see if we can note any of those places. There's Karmazinivka there, Novovodyani, there was activity there yesterday. So we can see that, yes, there is activity on this front line. And we know that the Russians have quite a good force concentration around here. So if they're going to be able to kind of attack anywhere successfully, it would be around here. But the Ukrainians are also fairly well stocked here too. That's kind of caused a bit of a stalemate over time. But actually, the Russians are fairly well equipped in that area, as far as I understand. Anyway, Ukrainian Eastern Forces spokesperson Cherevati has noted that the Russian forces are actively trying to break through Ukrainian defensive lines along the Kupiansk-Liman front using Storm Z assault units staffed with former convicts. He's also said that there are elements of the reserves there, the BARS, combat units, and unspecified private military companies active there too. Russian Mill blogger said that there is the Central Military District operating around there as well. So you've got a whole mix of types of troops here, and it seems like the Russians are trying to take some ground here. But then, as I've said before, what is the objective here? Is the objective really to take some ground? Is that actually what they're trying to do? Or is it to distract the Ukrainians? Offense as a form of defense, get the Ukrainians to commit troops here, a bit like the Ukrainians are doing in Bakhmut, getting the Russians to fix their troops in that area to leave holes elsewhere. Well, this could be what the Russians are trying with the Ukrainians on that axis. And then Bilhorivka, there's activity going on there. And we come down towards Bakhmut, not too much other detail in that northern sector. So we'll go back to the ISW, see what's taking place there. And we have the geolocated combat footage. I'll show you that posted on the 6th of July, shows Russian artillery striking a Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle, actually I think it's a mine, on the western outskirts of Klishchivka, indicating that Ukrainian forces have made gains in the area. So it's all about Klishchivka pretty much. Now, if we go to look at what the situation is around here, this is Andrew Perpetua's map again. We can see that Ukrainians are pressuring in the north, and then around Klishchivka and around Kurdimivka there. But actually, there's indications that the Russians are trying to push back in and around Bakhmut itself, although Bakhivka, that area, we have the Ukrainians pushing too. So there's quite a lot of activity going on around Bakhmut. But there's a lot around Klishchivka. There's fighting on the outskirts of there as we speak, I think. A Russian Mill blogger reported Ukrainian troops captured several forested areas west of Klishchivka and putting increased pressure on Russian positions southwest of Bakhmut. Russian sources claim that Klishchivka itself remains under Russian control, and Mill bloggers circulated footage wherein several Russian soldiers claim they control the settlement and that heavy fighting is ongoing. Of course, this is last night's report. Things will have changed today, no doubt. Cherevati has noted that Ukrainian troops maintain the initiative around Bakhmut and and are pushing Russian forces back on the northern and southern flanks. To the front lines, no report says Ukraine has consolidated recent gains just to the north of Klishchiivka, is now actively attacking the entrance to the town itself. This is from last night. Meanwhile, Ukrainian units attacked the last remaining forest strips southwest of the town. And we'll go and have a look at this in more detail, just to get a few more sources. Based on geolocations, it's most likely that Ukraine has entered the outskirts of Klishchiivka, says Global War Monitor. The village has been occupied by Russia since January the 19th. And then here's the actually might be not be mines. It might be actually being bombarded here by Russian artillery. So anyway, that is a Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle getting hit in this location. That gives you an indication of what the Ukrainians are trying to do and where they're operating. We're going to have a look at that here. So the Klishchiivka is this village to the south of Bakhmut there, and we have this road coming in. That's that road curving round to the kind of northwest of Klishchiivka, and that's where that Ukrainian IFV was hit. We understand that. I mean, the Ukrainians have been pushing and pushing, getting closer and closer to Klishchiivka, and that we understand now they're fighting in Klishchiivka on the outskirts. This is the road coming in. There could be pressure by the Ukrainians along there. We have gains. The darker color signifies a Ukrainian gain, darker blue, as according to Syriac maps. So Syriac maps is agreeing now with Andrew Perpetua that the Ukrainians have basically pushed into this forest area here. I would say that they control all of these forest areas now, although Andrew Perpetua hasn't exactly indicated that on his maps. I think the understanding is that they do control that. He just waits for absolute verification. These have been shredded, these forests, by Russian artillery, and it appears that the Ukrainians are fighting over this trench network there, and I think could well be in control of that now. The Russians could have pulled out there. There was talk about Russians not pulling out fully from Klishchiivka, and then that was kind of changed to them pulling back somewhat from Klishchiivka. So I think they pulled some of their forces out from there. And then we go on to look at this. This is from this morning, just now in the Klishchiivka and in the Klishchiivka area, Ukrainian forces continue to storm key fortified positions. The fighting is extremely intense. The main battles occur for the northern heights and the southern approaches. Overnight, a Russian counterattack was repelled. This is a good explanation of what's going on by Radu Hosu, who talks about Bakhmut being a pretty successful kind of maneuver, I guess, by the Ukrainians in terms of fixing the troops in there. It's a bit long to go through now. I guess if I can go to the conclusion, the battle for Bakhmut, which I consider the second battle for Bakhmut, regardless of what Wikipedia says or what others say, is essential for Ukraine's operational objective to reach the Sea of Azov. So he sees it as part of the larger strategy, I guess, of the Ukrainians, that they will not succeed in getting to the Sea of Azov without doing what they're doing in Bakhmut now. It is successfully fixing Russian troops. They are sending their own reserves there to make sure that they do not lose Bakhmut. So he continues, if not even an attempt to penetrate Crimea. But as I said before, and I will say it again, don't forget to keep an eye on the Eastern Front. The night is long and full of terror for the Russians. On the land of the sunrise and sunsets, Russia has already lost. Now Ukraine just needs to win. For that, we need each and every one, blah, blah, blah. So he goes on. But I mean, that is all built on what he talks about with this strategy taking place in Bakhmut there, and that the Ukrainians are doing a good job, and obviously that's evident in Klishchiivka and to the north in Bakhivka. Although we are hearing less news about what's going on in Bakhivka, less than we are hearing about Klishchiivka, there's active fighting around Bakhivka. And then to the north, the Ukrainians are trying to come down this main supply route, the E40 or M03, into the north of Bakhmut. And if they can meet up there, then they'll be able to encircle these Russian troops in the Dubovo-Vasilivka area. But and as we can see from Syriac maps, there are also gains for the Ukrainians. These are confirmed gains, if you like. Andrew Perpetua already had this, as did Deep State Maps. Confirmed gains just in these dachas to the southwest of Bakhmut itself. There is fighting there. The Ukrainians made gains up here as well. So they're also involved in activities right next to Bakhmut too, and inside kind of the main kind of city area, if you like. I've also literally just realized I hadn't adjusted the Deep State map. They are in yellow here. This is a pro-Ukrainian map, a Deep State map. They have adjusted to show some gains in the Klishchivka area as well, around basically all around here. That's in line with the other mappers. They are 48 to 72 hours behind due to operational security. They've also got a slight improvement in the Bakhmut area. They had the Russian line sort of going across there. They've now adapted that to be more in line with the other mappers, but I would concentrate more on what Syriac and Andrew Perpetua say at the moment here. But yeah, certainly gains for the Ukrainians. And actually, if we come down, and this is probably one of the more significant bits of mapping changes today, which is coming from Andrew Perpetua. He pores over these in detail to see where the shelling takes place, to do geolocations, and he is showing that the Ukrainians have made advances along the canal here. This is significant because actually he was saying that the Ukrainians are going to be wanting to do what the Russians did, but in reverse. So the Russians advanced up the canal, and that allowed them to sort of pincer around here and so on and so forth, because it gave them kind of security along here. Well, actually, the Ukrainians are doing that themselves, kind of in reverse, and that will allow them to envelop these places like Adiivka and Klishchivka. They need to take the area down the canal because it's difficult to attack across the canal. So if you can come down from the north and up from the south, where they also have crossed the canal on towards Mayorsk, then that will be really useful for them, and they have done that, as according to Andrew Perpetua. So that is significant. That will help them pressure Kupiansk, because at the moment, really, they can only attack Kupiansk across the canal where there are tunnels, where the canal goes under the ground here. But of course, the Russians will know exactly where they're going to be attacking from, and it will be easier to defend. If they can now start attacking from the north as well, that will give them some advantage there. So yeah, a lot of activity in Bakhmut. There are claims that Ukrainians have advanced 1.5 kilometers, I think the general staff was saying, in Bakhmut, but they're not often very specific about exactly where. We go back to the ISW. Russian Mill blogger reported that Russian sources. No, that's fine. I've said all that. They then go on to mention that there is activity going on all around Bakhmut, as we already know, and it moves on to Adiivka. So we can go to Adiivka next on my map. That is a case of zooming out, coming down south. This purple line there indicates the annexed Russian line from 2014. So we can see that, there are areas where they are now fighting along that annexed line. And then we come down to Adiivka. So in Adiivka, there is the normal sort of activity going on. Marinka, Novomykhailivka, which is to the south of Adiivka. Other than that, there is sort of continued ground attacks taking place there. If we go to one of my sources here saying that district saying the Russians launched another offensive in the direction of Adiivka, which lasted more than 10 hours. As a result of repelling the assault, Ukrainian units damaged and then captured 2 T-80 BV-8 main battle tanks and destroyed more than a dozen Russian soldiers with the tank crews. So that would assume that the tank crews and the soldiers, so that would be a good sort of 20 soldiers taken out, 20 crew and soldiers taken out there. This is footage of it, but I won't go any further than that because you start seeing those dead soldiers. So that is good for the Ukrainians because it is a zero-sum game quite often, which is tanks that you lose to us, we gain when they are captured. So that is great, and they can be sent back, refurbished, and then sent back to the front line to fight for the Ukrainians. That is useful engagement for the Ukrainians there. Now, this is going down to the south near Marinka, so there's really not a lot of detail coming out of the front line around there, other than there was an attack I think Opitny is still pretty tasty around there. But I'm not sure where that Russian attack was, but it was repelled, and the Russians did lose some equipment. And then we come down to Marinka, where we see the reason I'm including this because I find it quite interesting that the Russians are using mine demining equipment in the area of Marinka, as well as the Ukrainians using that for their offensive. So here's a result. So what is the result? What do we see here? That's I don't like it when it goes back like that. Oh, yes, this is it. So what happened? So uh, originally, a T-72 B3 tank with an anti-mine trawl was immobilized by hitting a mine and became a good target for Javelin, presumably in the Marinka area. So this is thought to be in the Marinka area, and we have this T-tank with T-72 with those mine trawls at the front, which I think is interesting that they are demining in the area, and you can do that if you're going to want to go on the attack, really, rather than demining, I guess, behind your lines. You might want to do that if there are just mines everywhere and you need to remove yourself from the area. But I guess that probably signifies as attack more than defense. And it was then hit by a javelin to put it out of its misery, which is seen here because some people are saying, "Oh, that wasn't fully taken out." Actually, there's further footage to show that the javelin did really catastrophically end the life of that T-72. So that's in the Marinka area. It's just interesting because it signifies that the Russians are attacking, which they are, particularly around here to the south near Pobjeda. But I haven't heard anything else particularly of activity taking place there. So then we come down to the Donetsk area and onto the Velika Novosilka. Haven't heard too much about Vuhledar other than the Russians were pummeling that with artillery yesterday, destroying or further destroying some of the buildings, the high-rise buildings in Vuhledar. But yes, so we have gains, quite a few gains here, according to Andrew Perpetua's mapping, showing gains. I mean, you can see the difference between Suryat maps here and Andrew Perpetua. He's looked at shelling to see where the Ukrainians are. The Ukrainians are, if there are shelling marks, really heavy shelling marks, and because of the resolution of the satellite imagery he looks at, it has to be heavy shelling for him to medium to heavy shelling for him to pick it out. You won't see light shelling, like a couple of shells landing near a tree line won't show up, but repeated shelling, moderate to heavy, so that the tree line starts getting obliterated, then he knows that there is activity going on there. And if we go to Andrew Perpetua and to see, let's see if we've got that. Where is his talk? Just to give you an idea of the kind of work he does, here it is. So this is a whole thread where he talks about, there is shelling going on here. So here's Robotna. So I know we're not there yet, but this gives you an idea. There are signs of fighting along all the eyeballs. Northeast of these western points, we had a video of Ukrainian forces driving. So he looks at video, looks at satellite imagery, pieces it all together and draws his map. Southwest, seemingly unalarmed, suggesting these southwestern eyeballs are likely the front line. So what he's saying is that Frontline is probably here. It's a grey zone, but this is probably where all the fighting's taking place. This is heavy shelling, but he looks at the types of shelling and says, well, actually, so here, where it's all brown there, that means that there's heavy shelling taking place there, which means that one of the sides is there to be shelled. Likely Ukrainians are there, Russians are heavy shelling, so that means this is where the Ukrainians are pushed up to, so on and so forth. So you get the idea of the methodology that he's using there. So we go back to the Donetsk and the area we're talking about, Velika Novosilka here. We have, actually that's wrong, that's in Robotna. That's further to the west. So Velika Novosilka, we've got Ukrainian forces, and this has just come out now. This is past midday, so this is in the last hour. Ukrainian forces have advanced 1.5 kilometers on the western flank of Novodonetsk, bypassing it and gaining fire control over the southern road. Okay, let's put that on my map. So here we have Novodonetsk here, 1.5 kilometers advance for the Ukrainians there. That might be just verifying what Andrew Perpetua had anyway, or it might be further advances, but it sounds like that's confirming Ukrainians being in that area. If we look at that, it could be a little bit further actually. So yeah, it could be down here that the Ukrainians are making advances really towards Kremenchik there, but yeah, so expect some advances, maybe changes to the map tomorrow. And then we have some advances near Staromorsk, or confirmation that the Ukrainians really are fighting on the outskirts of Staromorsk, and indeed Urzhiny. That was claimed yesterday. And then in between there and Pryutne, the Ukrainians are advancing south of Rivnepil. There's mapping changes for Andrew Perpetua's map there as well in both of these areas. So good, successful advances by the Ukrainians, but it is, going to be tough work. They are going to have to clear minefields. They're going to have to consolidate areas they've taken. This is coming from Dmitry, a video. Dmitry from War translating a video of Russian mobilized troops of the Russian regime have lost over 50% of their company resisting the offensive in Novodorivka, west of Rivnepil, both recently liberated by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Mobiks are forced to fight without artillery support, are left without provision and water, and as they claim, they haven't been paid since January. So things aren't looking good for some of the forces, at least in the area. Now, we know this is in this area. That's half that. We know that the Russians are really resisting heavily, right? They are kind of doing counterattacks, the kind of offense is the best form of defense, to try and keep the Ukrainians from advancing too quickly. Now, there's questions about whether that's a sensible thing to do. Do they not let the Ukrainians try and lose their own forces on the larger trench lines that they've built in the Surovikin line that's further back here? Or do they attack and try and resist consistently? But then that is going to attrit the Russian troops probably at a rate that's beneficial to the Ukrainians. So there's some people saying that actually this is not a sensible thing for them to do, but they're doing it anyway. And now you can see that the Russian troops are complaining about that kind of strategy. Here, they are saying that they're not getting artillery support either. Now, we know that the Russians definitely are using artillery in the area. I mean, that's precisely how Andrew Perpetua triangulates his mapping, but it doesn't mean to say they are supporting their own troops in doing so necessarily all the time in all the places. So that is a situation around there. We don't know about Pryutne, whether that is definitely under control. I mean, the claim was that is under Ukrainian control. That was regained yesterday, but there's just no confirmation of that yet from any of the sources, no visual confirmation. If we come down to the ISW, they say that Russian mobile bloggers claim Ukrainian forces attacked Russian positions near Staromorsk, and Pryutne, Geolocated footage published on the 5th of July indicates that Russian forces still maintain positions near Pryutne and are likely in control of the settlement. So we go and check those out. So here we have NOL reports reporting a group of Russian heavy equipment tried to approach Ukrainian positions, were knocked out just north of Pryutne. This was on July the 6th, so this is yesterday, on the border of Donetsk, Zaporizhia. And that would suggest that here we have the geolocation of that. That, of course, is going to be somewhat out of date now. If that was yesterday, it was then probably footage from the day before itself. So, you get the idea that perhaps the Ukrainians control Pryutne now. So that's north of there. Now already Andrew Perpetua has this area under Ukrainian control. So yeah, that would indicate that the Ukrainians have advanced, but it doesn't necessarily tell us who is in control of what. And given that that's probably a couple of days old as well, we can probably go, yeah. And then moving west from there, we come on towards Piatikhatki, via Robotna. So gains for the Ukrainians in the Velika-Novoselka axis. So that is good for the Ukrainians. Not a lot of news coming out of Marfapil, Drozhnyanka, Myrna, and indeed to the east of Robotna. So around Novopokrovka, where there was activity, fighting possibly in Novopokrovka, but haven't heard anything in the last 24 hours explicitly about that. Again, Andrew Perpetua has gains in this area to the west of Robotna. So we have gains in the fields here. As you can see, the difference between Suryat maps and Andrew Perpetua there is pretty consistent right along this axis. But I would be trusting Andrew Perpetua's mapping much more here. I think the level of detail he goes into for himself and not relying on other sources is quite significant. So we see War Mapper here showing that the area north of Robotna has been liberated by the Ukrainians, but that's kind of what we knew anyway. Russian channels are noting an increased offensive activity of Ukrainian forces along the Zaporizhia front line. Fighting would be ongoing in different directions along the front. So the Russians are talking about how, it is difficult around there, and the Ukrainians are doing quite a bit of fighting. And again, all of this around Robotna there. He says, closer to Robotna, it's unknown to me how far south Ukraine has moved and how much remains a grey zone. They could be only a few hundred meters from the town, which is significantly further south than I depict. So he's basically saying that, well, it depends where you're talking about. There were claims 2 days ago that Ukrainians were one field away from Robotna. So my guess is that they are fighting on the outskirts of Robotna for sure. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that. To the east of Robotna, there are areas with obvious heavy fighting, and that's depicted by that denotes heavy shelling. So you've got a tree line up there that is no longer a tree line, which and look at all this. So all of this brown, those are probably hundreds of artillery shells. So that means that almost certainly the Ukrainians were there, and the Russians are trying to absolutely hammer them. And the same could be said for this as well. So that tree line or path or whatever has been obliterated as well, and that's how he shows that there is activity, and he'll put that on the eyeballs there. And yeah, so he says Ukraine has very likely moved up significantly further than I've depicted from the overview here. So again, that's Robotna. So it could well be that they are significantly further forward in these areas than he has depicted. But he's being a bit cautious there. So anyway, the ISW says Russian mill bloggers notably continue to give diverging accounts of the nature of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia Oblast. One Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces attempted to advance from Pyatikaki towards Zerebyanki. So this is going to the west again, where I have no changes in the map. But yeah, advances towards Zerebyanki, says the ISW, saying one Russian mill blogger claims that. And in two small groups with 15 personnel each. So that's only 30 Ukrainian troops. And then other mill bloggers claiming that larger Ukrainian groups have conducted unsuccessful attacks in the same area with groups of up to 50 personnel. So differing accounts. One mill blogger criticized other mill bloggers for intentionally downplaying the Ukrainian presence in Pyatikaki. So when you are looking at, say, Syriac maps, and they're saying, well, the map is moving in this way, are they relying on Russian mill bloggers who are downplaying Ukrainian advances? Likewise, you can ask that about Ukrainian mappers like Andrew Perpetua, but we know that he basically doesn't go along with what other pro-Ukrainian voices say. So he does his own work. So that's why I put a lot of store in his mapping. One mill blogger criticized others for intentionally downplaying the Pyatikaki situation, stated that Ukrainian forces have been entrenched in the settlement since June the 17th. So this is really interesting. The whole claim, like Syriac maps only changed their map from Pyatikaki, 2 days ago, or yesterday it might have even been, where actually mill bloggers saying the Ukrainians have been there since June the 17th. That's like almost 20 days ago. So Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces, since June the 17th, despite repeated Russian claims that Russian forces have cleared the settlement or prevented Ukrainian forces from reaching it. So that is an interesting admission there. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces also conducted assaults in the direction of Robotna and made unspecified gains in the direction of Verbova. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainians did not conduct active operations in the Zaporizhia direction at all outside of Pyatikaki. So wildly differing claims. I would assume that, yes, the Ukrainians are being active in all of those areas. Interesting that there's, activity towards Verbova there, and that would be in line with what Andrew Perpetua is saying, that there's activity to the east of Robotna. Okay, so coming on now to the Antonivsky Bridge. Bridgehead here, almost literally. We have again continued activity. Not really too sure of the details around. Actually, no. There's a few more things. There's one more thing to say about Oh yeah, it's just I had a bit of video of demining going on in the Zaporizhia region. Just in case you've never seen a Miklik doing blasting my ears out, doing its thing. So. Oops, excuse the French in the Ukrainian. So that's them sending those up. You don't get to see it explode there, but the point is, of course, they're doing a lot of demining. How many of these will they have to use a day? As I've said to you before, when every field has to be demined, just the amount of resources you're going to need to clear pathways just to attack an individual village. And you think, right, once they've done that, then they've got to go here, 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 here. They're going to be using so much demining equipment. They need a lot of that kit. Right, now on to Antonivsky, and really not a massive amount to say other than they are still working in the area, still evidence that both sides are trying to pressure each other. Reporting from Ukraine did a whole video on activity around that bridgehead, basically saying that the Ukrainians did a really good move and caught the Russians in a trap, kind of sucked them in. The Russians then attacked, and then they lost a huge amount of mechanized equipment. Go and check out reporting from Ukraine's video. I mean, I can't verify the claims being made there, but the Russians seem to have some of the video evidence seems to suggest that yeah, they were trying to push the Ukrainians out this bridgehead. What reporting from Ukraine says is as they pushed here to try and clear them out with troops, IFVs and whatnot, then they were able to be hit. The Russians were able to be hit from the other side of the river. You can imagine ATGMs, artillery, mortars, or everything would be able to pounce on the Russians there. So then the Russians got caught here, and then the Ukrainians kind of did them over, really. to kind of summarize it, Russians. Yeah, so if we say the risk did not pay off, and after suffering substantial losses, the Russian forces began their retreat. The Russian command decided to double down, reinforce the ground units, and initiated a second major axis of advance. The primary assumption was that if Ukrainians were pushing east of the bridge and their positions west of the bridge were weaker, Russian sources reported that their operation had stalled and their troops found themselves in a precarious situation. Ukrainian sources later reported that radio intercepts revealed a reluctance to push without air support, preferably using FAB 500 bombs. Eventually, it became clear that the desired strike wouldn't occur, and Russian forces began a slow retreat, all the while receiving ATGMs in the rear. In sum, the Ukrainians successfully lured the Russians into a trap, exposing their flanks to fire from the opposite side of the river. Russian analysts blame the failed operation on poor planning by the Russian command. The Ukrainian deputy defense minister commented on the situation, stating that the intense fighting near the bridge, Ukrainian forces inflicted significant losses on the enemy. Specifically, that day, Ukrainians eliminated 50, and this is from reporting from Ukraine, 50 Russian soldiers, 23 armored personnel or armored fighting vehicles and armored cars, as well as multiple boats and drones. So the idea, and again, treat that with a pinch of salt, etc., but the idea is that the Ukrainians might have attrited the Russians significantly in this area. It might have been an attempt by the Russians to push the Ukrainians out, ended in the Russians losing a significant number of troops and armored pieces of equipment. Is that verified? No. Does it sound plausible? Yes. Do we have evidence of the Russians losing at least some vehicles in the area? Video evidence? Absolutely, we do. A number of vehicles have been lost along this road. So, yeah, that situation in Antonivsky. And that's the end of the daily Frontline report. Please like, subscribe, and share. Any other information you have on the front line, put it in the comments below. Get the conversation rolling, and I'll get back to you tomorrow later with an update, with an extra video, giving you extra things to think about concerning the war. Take care. Speak soon.